I'm Chris Eukins, the Lynn David Research Professor I'm Chris Eukins, the Lynn David Research Professor in George Washington University Law School's Government Procurement Law Program. Thank you very much for joining us. Next slide, please. Welcome to this, our first webinar of 2023. A special welcome to our worldwide audience. Today's program had over 500 registrants from 43 countries across 6 continents. Our webinar today will feature a presentation by Professor Brad Nathan of Columbia University's Business School based on his PhD dissertation. As Brad will explain, he examined whether requiring vendors to submit proprietary cost and pricing information during federal contract negotiations had a harmful or beneficial impact on contract outcomes. This is a cutting-edge paper because it's one of the first efforts to analyze huge amounts of federal procurement data to produce workable insights for practitioners and policymakers. The recording of today's program will be available on publicprocurementinternational.com and also on GW Law School's Government Procurement Law Program YouTube page. During the course of today's presentation, if you could please use the chat function, and we'll be responding to chat questions as we go, and not use the Q&A function. We find that the chat function is the best approach, and also the chat function is retained as a public file. We'll be posting it with the other program materials at publicprocurementinternational.com. I want to emphasize that all speaker statements today are in their personal capacity. Next slide, please. Our presenter today, Brad Nathan, is a lecturer and postdoctoral research scholar at Columbia University. He has a master's degree in economics and a PhD from the University of Texas, a master's in finance from the University of Houston, and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. As he'll be discussing, he also has private sector experience in supply chain issues as he worked at Intel as an electrical project engineer. We're very grateful to have Brad join us today. This program is being coordinated with the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, a leading center for procurement research, which is part of Stevens Institute of Technology. Phil Anton, the chief scientist of the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, has been an outstanding partner for several studies we've done through ERIC. I'm very glad that Phil could join us. He's been a little ill, so he may not be speaking a lot, but Phil, thank you very, very much for joining us today. We're also very fortunate to have John Tanaga, who serves as the Principal Director of Defense Pricing and Contracting within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's responsible for the pricing and contracting policy matters that relate to over $300 billion in annual contract obligations. As the functional leader of the Defense Department's 30,000 plus contracting and purchasing professionals, he's responsible for their workforce career development. He serves as the principal advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Sustainment on acquisition and procurement negotiation strategies for all major weapon systems and major automated information systems programs. John was commissioned in the U.S. Air Force in 1988 and retired from active duty in 2008. He has a law degree from Catholic University's Columbia School of Law and has been a member of the Senior Executive Service since 2014. We're also joined by Craig Barrett, who teaches cost and pricing with us at George Washington University Law School and philosophy at Howard University. Until recently, Craig was senior counsel in the government contracts group, the law firm of Crowell & Mooring. As of this week, he works in-house with the accounting firm BDO USA, serving as the lead attorney for their public sector vertical. Craig spent nearly 18 years in government service, both as an active duty service member. He was a judge advocate in the Marine Corps and as Associate General Counsel in the U.S. Government Publishing Office. Next is David Drapkin, who coincidentally was one of the fathers of the federal procurement data system that is the heart of today's study. Dave has helped me teach a course in procurement reform at GW for over 15 years as a former senior procurement executive at the General Services Administration. He was recently a co-principal investigator with me on 2 congressionally mandated studies through the Acquisition Innovation Research Center on bid protests and debarment, and he previously served as chairman of the Section 809 panel, which published extensive recommendations to improve the Department of Defense acquisition system. He is chairman of the Procurement Roundtable and is one of the recognized leaders of our acquisition community. Finally, we're joined by Tara Ward, a partner and a leader of the Government Contracts Group at McDermott, Will & Emery. Tara is regularly recognized as one of the top public procurement lawyers in the United States. She's also one of those incredibly important people who help hold our program together at GW. She has taught cost and pricing and serves as the editor-in-chief of the Public Contract Law Journal, which is co-published by the American Bar Association and GW Law School. Kara received her AB from Princeton University and her JD with honors from George Washington University Law School. Brad Nathan will be presenting for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to panel discussion and questions. Along the way, as noted, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and the other panelists and I will be reviewing those as the program proceeds. With that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar, and many thanks to Phil and Dinesh at the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, ERIC, for inviting me to present. A special thanks to all of the panelists, John, Dave, Tara, Craig, for being a part of this, and to Chris for moderating. I look forward to your comments and discussion shortly. Please feel free to jump in wherever you have any questions or comments. That's for the panelists. Now, with that said, I'm thrilled to present my paper titled Accounting Disclosure Requirements in Procurement Contracting. This paper came from my dissertation out of the University of Texas at Dallas. I got into researching procurement due to my 4 years of experience as an electrical project engineer at Intel, where I managed the design and construction of electrical scope for the cutting edge CPU chips factories that Intel is building across the world. Now let's get into the paper. Now, relationships between buyers and suppliers, one hallmark of them is that suppliers tend to know more about how they came up with their own prices. And in my paper, I study the setting of public procurements. Why? Because it's a really big deal. In 2018 alone, there was $13 trillion worth of procurement spending across the globe, which was equivalent to 15% of global GDP. In the US, the vast majority of federal contracts are what are called negotiated. That is, they're not awarded solely based on the lowest price, but other factors that are weighed, such as the expected performance of the contractors, the contract terms, and more. Now, in the private sector as well as in the public sector, both alike, procurement is very interested in establishing that prices are reasonable. And they typically do this in at least one of the following three ways. They can either rely on competition among multiple independent bidders, relying on their contracting officials' knowledge and judgments and experience with historical prices, as well as or supplier disclosures that support their proposed prices. Now, contracting officials, and I lump into this term all contracting officers, as well as any government workers who deal from procurement, who deal in the writing, in the bidding, or the award and execution monitoring of the contracts, monitoring the execution. Now, contracting officials for the US government are allowed to require any data that's necessary that they would like, as long as it's required to be able to establish price reasonableness. Now, cost or pricing data, this is a term that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. Anytime you hear that, just think it's all factual information that's prudent buyers and contractors would reasonably expect to affect price negotiations. Now, this could be really detailed data, cost, including all cost line items that make up the price, vendor quotes, drawings, etc. This is submitted by contractors to the government with their proposed bids when requested. Now, contractors may also have to certify that the cost of pricing data is current, accurate, and complete. And then any sort of data that's supplied by a contractor that is not certified is called other than certified cost or pricing data. So this is just a term that's common in the industry for federal procurements. Now, the regulation that I studied in this paper was called the Truth in Negotiations Act. It's now called Truthful Cost or Pricing Data, but colloquially, it's still referred to by its fondly referred to also as the Truth in Negotiations Act, TINA. In the way that TINA works is it says that above a certain price threshold, contractors to the government have to provide cost or pricing data, unless the certified cost or pricing data, unless an exception applies. And one of the main exceptions that I'm concerned about for this paper is having multiple bids from independent contractors. What that essentially boils down to is, in practice, TINA requires contracting officials to either request contractors privately disclose certified cost or pricing data, or take measures to receive multiple bids, an expectation. What this effectively does is limits, out of those three ways that contracting officials can establish prices are reasonable, it limits it essentially restricts contracting officials from just relying on their judgments for these higher dollar contracts. So they have to either rely on having competition among multiple independent bidders or relying on additional data. Now, the contracting official's decision of whether or not to promote competition or to require certified cost or pricing data to comply with TINA's requirements is a function of several factors. These include personal considerations, that is how much cost it may impose upon the contracting official in terms of time and effort, maybe their ability to award to favored suppliers, as well as effects on taxpayer value. These could be things such as the government's processing costs, effects on award times, price impacts or bargaining power impacts, the expected quality of performance of contracts, and/or fairness concerns. And finally, contracting officials should take into consideration that requiring data may ward off suppliers, and that could decrease competition. Now, for those who aren't familiar with TINA, I'm going to go ahead and repeat what TINA does because it's a little bit of a mouthful if you're not familiar. So TINA requires that contracting officials either request contractors privately disclose certified cost or pricing data or take measures to receive multiple bids. That's what it essentially boils down to. Now, the research question that I addressed in my study is how do TINA's requirements affect primarily, I focus on competition. And that can be openness to essentially how many contractors are able to bid, as well as the number of bids received. I also study the effects on contract performance, which can include changes to contracts, modifications to contracts, as well as the effects on cost overruns or budget overruns. And I also look at the effects of TINA on whether or not a cost plus contract, the frequency with which cost plus contracts are awarded. And this in the academic literature is also referred to as completeness. That is, how much does the final cost of the contract, how much is it contingent upon different things that can happen after the contract has been awarded that are already included essentially in the contract. So fixed price contracts are the most complete, firm fixed price, whereas cost plus tend to be less complete. Now, why do I study contract competition? Well, because contract competition, aside from potentially lowering prices, it can also increase the quality of any goods or services that are supplied, as well as lead to greater fairness and reduce supply chain risk. Now, the effect of TINA on competition is going to depend on the contracting officials' choice between competition and data. On the one hand, if the contracting officials request data, then the costs associated to the suppliers from having to gather the data, prepare it, as well as any proprietary concerns they have about this data being private. So they don't want to, even if they're privately disclosing it to the government, they don't want to necessarily have that disclosed to a party outside of their organization because it's potentially could be received by their competitors somewhere down the line. There's a revolving door between the government and the contractors where employees from the government will also often go to work for contractors and vice versa. Further, there can be bid protests, legal challenges, and the discovery during these can sometimes result in proprietary information being gleaned, made public or disclosed to competitors. And there are also Freedom of Information Act requests, which in some circumstances can result in data being disclosed. Now, if the contracting official chooses to promote competition so as to not have to require the data, then naturally that should result in an increase in competition. So there are these two countervailing effects, and the question is going to be which one dominates, which one is stronger. The ways that contracting officials can promote competition, and I argue each one of these requires greater attention on behalf of procurement, include loosening specifications so they're not as narrow and applying to a particular supplier or small set of suppliers. They can seek out additional vendors, bidders, and they can reduce restrictions on who's able to bid. And they can also make it easier for suppliers to be qualified in order to compete. So in my study, I focus on sample of contracts awarded by, and I'll get into the sample in greater detail shortly, but awarded by what I call early adopters. And these are agencies that had this switch in the TINA threshold in 2018 from $750,000 prior to $2 million. And it's been there ever since for these agencies. These include the DoD, the Department of Energy, the US Department of Agriculture, many large agencies. And their contracts actually make up the vast majority of all negotiated non-commercial federal contracts. Now, the way that TINA threshold works in practice is above this TINA threshold. Well, let me break it down here. So we have the TINA threshold, which I mentioned is 750,000 up until 2018 for early adopters, $2 million since. Above what is called a simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000, contracting officials are able to request any data, any factual data that they would need to be able to establish the price is reasonable. That includes cost or pricing data. Now, if the price of the contract exceeds the TINA threshold, then certified cost or pricing data is required unless an exception is met. And these exceptions include multiple bids. That's the most important for my study. Also, commercial contracts and contracts where prices are set by law or statute. So the commercial contracts I will be removing from my sample, and I also, so that way I can be able to focus more so on multiple bids, the trade-off between that and cost or pricing data being required. And we'll talk about that more shortly. Now, the first analysis that I run is examining the effect of TINA on whether or not cost or pricing data is required. So this is to see whether or not TINA has any effect on contracting officers' behavior, and whether it has any teeth, so to speak. So the red, I have here several dots. The dots correspond with price bins, which are $50,000 wide. So in this each $50,000 range, the height of the dots corresponds with the fraction or the percentage of contracts in that bin that require cost or pricing data. The blue dots correspond with the time period where the $750,000 threshold's in effect. And the red dots correspond with after July 2018, when the $2 million threshold's in effect. On the x-axis, we have the contract price ranges. So if we focus firstly on the $750,000 threshold, which is demarcated by this red dashed line here, and we look at the blue dots, which correspond with the time period that is the effective threshold, we see here, approaching from the left, there's a large jump right at the threshold in how often cost or pricing data is required. And similarly, if we look at the red dots, which at the $2 million threshold, and those are the dots that correspond with contracts that are awarded when that $2 million threshold is in effect, we again see a large threshold, or a large jump right at the threshold. Now, importantly, right at the threshold here, at $750,000 threshold, the red dots don't exhibit any jump because they don't correspond with the time period that the $750,000 threshold's in effect. And likewise, for the blue dots, we don't see any jump at 2 million because the threshold's not in effect for those contracts. That's what we would expect. Further above the threshold, both thresholds, these contracts don't seem to be discernible. And that's to be expected because in this region, the contracts are always subject to TINA. And similarly, below both thresholds, they are indistinguishable because they are always not subject to TINA. So this shows that Truth in Negotiations Act has a substantial effect on how often cost or pricing data is required. Now, getting into more of the details of how I set up the study, the main analyses of my study. Firstly, the sample that I use are those contracts which are most likely to be affected by TINA, or more likely to be affected by TINA. And I include all negotiated contracts that are non-commercial and prime that were awarded by the early adopter agencies. Those include the DoD, DOE, USDA, and many others, several others. And the main outcome that I look at are competition variables. And the different types of competition variables I focus on are, firstly, sole source, whether or not contract is awarded as a sole source, that is a non-competed contract. And the reason I look at sole source contracts is that, yes, all contracts generally speaking, are by default contracting officials try to make them subject to full and open competition. However, they can determine whether or not they decree that only a single source is available that can meet the requirements stated in the solicitation. And there, if the solicitation is narrow, then it might exclude many competitors who could perhaps fulfill the government's needs, but they're not stated as such in the solicitation. Or there may be a degree of judgment involved on behalf of the contracting officer as to whether there really is only one source that's able to fulfill those stated need. I also look at the effects of TINA on whether or not multiple offers are received. And the specific type of design that I employ is called regression discontinuity design. What this effectively does is compare contracts right above the threshold to contracts just below the threshold. And I examine the difference in the outcome variable. In this case, the first case is competition, how competition differs between contracts that are subject to TINA, those are treatment contracts, and those that are not subject to TINA, the control contracts. And I use a bandwidth. Well, firstly, I run two separate analyses with this RDD type of design. First one is around the $750,000 threshold while it's in effect. That's between July 2015 and June 2018. And that sample contains 41,993 contracts. And the second analysis I run is around the $2 million threshold when it's in effect. And that's between June 2018 up until March 2020, when the government issued emergency procurement orders. That sample contains about 10,492 contracts. Actually, that's the exact number it has. Now, also in this analysis, I use several types of controls, namely linear price controls. Also, I control for product service code, the year quarter of the contract award, and the original duration of the contract. Also, whether or not a set-aside is used and the different types of set-asides. So here's a snapshot of the results. So this shows the effects of TINA on whether the frequency with which sole source contracts are awarded. And on the left-hand side, this is a plot that corresponds with the $750,000 threshold at this red line during the period in which it's in effect. And on the right-hand side, we have the $2 million threshold plots when it's effective. Now, if we start looking at the $750,000 threshold, we see that as contract prices increase, right at the threshold, we see a large negative jump in the frequency with which sole source contracts are awarded. That indicates that TINA has a substantial and significant effect on how often sole source contracts are awarded. It actually decreases the frequency of sole source contracts, that indicating that competition is improving. And likewise, we see a similar effect at the $2 million threshold. So these results are actually quite surprising to most of the practitioners I've spoken to. By and large, they expected that TINA should be warding off contract competition, should be warding off suppliers from even competing in the first place. But however, I find that TINA actually improves competition in net. And that I chalk up to the contracting officials promoting competition so as to not have to require the data and its associated costs to both the suppliers and to the government having to process it, longer reward times, et cetera. Now, the reason I believe practitioners expect so strongly for TINA to ward off competition is that they tend to focus on the way that it's written. TINA says that above the threshold, the TINA threshold, suppliers to the government have to provide certified cost or pricing data unless an exception applies. So they focus on the certified cost or pricing data effect, but they don't maybe keep in mind as much that one of the main exceptions is whether or not multiple bids are expected. So there can be this trade-off, and that the procurement system can use to actually decide whether or not to require the data. Now, looking at the alternative measure of competition, whether or not a contract receives multiple offers or multiple bids, we see for the $750,000 threshold a positive jump right at the threshold, indicating that more contracts receive multiple offers. That is an improvement in competition. Similarly, around the $2 million threshold, we see a positive effect of the threshold on competition. And those results hold for looking simply at the raw number of bids that are received, as well as whether or not a contract is awarded using open competition. Now, next, I examine the effect of TINA on contract performance and completeness, that is, whether a cost-plus contract is awarded or not. And I do this for two reasons. One is to be able to provide evidence against a particular alternative explanation for the competition results. If contracting officials tend to often open up competition, but then award the contract to their favored bidders regardless, well, that would potentially be an issue unless the suppliers were not aware that the contracting officer was going to award the contract to the supplier beforehand, right? So that there's actually a risk, that the perceived risk to the supplier that they could lose if they are not more competitive, right? So if they don't affect their bidding in some way, if they don't alter it in some way, or at least feel the pressure that they may need to, then they could lose the contract. So that should have some benefit to the government, that sort of competition. Now, if the contracting official were to say to the supplier beforehand, hey, I'm going to open competition, but then award it to you no matter what, well, then that should have no effect on, no benefit to the government, surely. And then if that's the case, we wouldn't expect there to be any effect on performance either for those contracts, particularly those that don't require the data, because data can help monitoring of contracts later on. So I test for that. I also look at performance because it's interesting in its own right. And there are actually two countervailing effects that I predict for TINA's requirements on performance. On the one hand, it can boost competition if the data is required. I'm sorry, not boost competition. It can improve performance if the data is required, or if there's greater attention paid by contracting officials to not have to require the data. On the other hand, it could decrease competition, this regulation, because if to the extent that TINA improves competition, I should say increases competition, that may increase price pressure on suppliers. And so they may try to buy in, essentially lowballing, issuing lowball offers, but then trying to make up for it with renegotiations, change orders later on. And they may also deliver just lower quality in that case. So what I find is actually the net effect is that TINA results in improved performance for the contracts in the form of fewer modifications to contracts and less cost or budget overruns around the $750,000 threshold in particular. And this is due to the data/attention effect that I mentioned a moment ago. I also find weak evidence that cost-plus contracts are less frequent around the $2 million threshold. And I run a whole litany of different robustness checks of my results, from heterogeneity tests, which examines different subsamples where I predict that the effects of TINA should either be stronger or weaker. And I do find that they correspond with the expectations there. They're consistent with what we would expect. I also run substitution tests, which confirm that there is a substitution effect between how often the data is required and whether or not contracts have multiple bids or receive more or less likely to be sole source. Further, I also look at something called a difference in discontinuities design, which is similar to the main type of design I use, the regression discontinuity design, but it factors in a time dimension. So it essentially shows that the effects on the contracts where the TINA thresholds relaxed actually correspond with what we would expect if TINA's effects were no longer applying for those contracts. So I find essentially those contracts have less competition when they no longer are subject to TINA. Also, I run many different placebo tests. That is, I run tests on contracts where TINA should have no effect. And importantly, I find that when the TINA threshold is not in effect, and for contracts where they are exempted from TINA's requirements, neither of those show any of the results that I find for the main samples that I test that are subject to TINA. I also run bunching and splitting tests, and bunching, of course, is so my regression discontinuity design, the main design I use, assumes that there's not significant manipulation of the prices of contracts to try to circumvent the TINA threshold. And I find very limited evidence and suggests that economically speaking, there's not significant presence of bunching or splitting. And I run several other types of analyses in my paper. Now, what are the main takeaways of this paper for practitioners? Well, this paper helps to inform the debate that's ongoing about TINA and cost or pricing data. On the one hand, proponents of cost or pricing data say that it helps the government to have greater bargaining power. This information that's in cost or pricing data is very valuable to the government. On the other hand, many who are against cost or pricing data and TINA as well, to a certain extent, argue that these requirements, well, the government wants to attract more innovative companies. And these requirements of TINA actually make it more difficult. They can prevent, especially more innovative companies, from wanting to share their sensitive data with the government. So it prevents them from bidding in the first place. And there are several different initiatives in the government to be able to award contracts to more innovative companies that are not subject to the same requirements in the FAR, right? Or they are subject to peeled back versions of TINA. This includes other transaction authority, TINA Light. Now, the results in my paper suggest that TINA, well, first off, my results are not generalizable to all possible threshold values, nor all price ranges of contracts. However, my results do suggest that there are two countervailing effects here. On one hand, it may ward off competition, these are data requirements. On the other hand, it may cause contracting officials to promote competition. And if the government is to peel back TINA's requirements, then that may result in a diminishing of TINA's competition increasing effects. So one recommendation would be that for any contracts where the government is reducing TINA's requirements, they can compensate with other policies to promote competition. They should really focus on that. These can include dedicated supplier recruitment teams, having a checklist of different suppliers that have been invited to bid. They could have a review process to verify that specifications can't be relaxed any further to a meaningful degree. And they can enlist contracting officials with expertise and training in specifications. So in conclusion, this paper is the first to provide empirical evidence on several key aspects of TINA. And I find that TINA's requirements can actually increase contract competition, performance, and completeness. And I showed evidence that this is due to the procurement system paying greater attention to contracts affected by TINA. And we are ending right on time here. So with that, I will open it to questions and discussion from the panelists.
Thank you very much, Brad. And this is really a very refreshing new take and with some really interesting insights. I have a number of questions, but I want to open up to the other panelists first. Do the other panelists have questions they'd like to ask? John?
Sure, very good. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Brad, for your outstanding work here. As you mentioned, the conclusions you've reached weren't necessarily what many of us in the community might have expected, the relationship between TINA and competition. On that last slide 20, you mentioned the alternatives that might reduce what is seen by many in industry as significantly burdensome to comply with TINA. So the TINA Light initiative is one we sought at the Department of Defense. I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail on that and suggest that it is an opportunity to lower the administrative burden associated with TINA compliance. There is both a time component to that and a cost component to compliance. The time you can refer to the sweeps and just contractors needing to take the time to make sure that they've actually given us all the information that they're going to certify to. And time is a function for our mission requirements, because the sooner we can get to closure on our business deals, the better we're able to deliver capability sooner. So time is important, but there's also an administrative expense associated with compliance. And so I would say the initial use cases for at least the authority that the Congress has given us to lower some of those administrative requirements under what we call the TINA Light Section 890 authority. Has really been applied to follow-on production of major weapon systems. I just preview for the audience here. We do intend to publish the results of what we're seeing in that pilot authority. We do appreciate the fact that our Congress has given us an extension of that authority, so we're going to be able to continue to see those results, and particularly with your work, Brad, and trying to understand the impact that might have on competition. To date, we've only applied it to follow-on production. I just wanted to foot stomp one point that you made. Certainly, wholeheartedly agree on your slide 9 about the motivation of contracting officials on the government side to do everything we can to make sure, as competition advocates, we're advancing maximum opportunities for industry to participate. That may entail, as you say, loosening specifications, make sure we're not unduly restricting competition with our requirements, whether they're place of performance or other types of requirements. And there's also other techniques that our Congress has given us to open the aperture, I would say, to what might be considered a competitive environment. One being the commercial solutions opening solicitation technique that avails ourselves of the wider range of commercial solutions in a competitive environment. So thank you again for this work.
You're welcome, John. Thank you for your comments, and I appreciate that. Craig, yes, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I had to get off mute. No, thank you, Brad, for that presentation. And I love the way you actually set up the discussion by first coming out with the idea and the concept that the buyer and supplier relationship is marked by opportunistic behavior. And I think that really sets the stage, right? Because we have to think about both parties in the transaction being motivated by self-interest. And if they're motivated by self-interest, they also are actually rational in the sense that they are going to choose the course of action that they think is most efficient to materialize in their respective self-interest. And I think from the government perspective, their self-interest or our self-interest might be to get better outcomes or best value, if you will, reasonable price of quality services. And for the contractor to maximize their profits, so to speak. And so the question therefore becomes, is it in the context of these requirements and these regulations, is the contractor going to be better off? What are the choices that the contractor would make in this context, whether to be participate in a competition or to actually get involved? And I think that the conventional wisdom was that these requirements were going to ward off these individuals. And what you seem to be doing is dispelling that myth. One specific question I have is that, is it even possible to even measure those individuals who may not participate in the first instance, simply because there is, whether correctly or incorrectly, there is the belief that it's going to add an increased cost or is going to pose some type of risk of their competitive data being placed out there and putting them at a disadvantage competitively in the commercial industry.
Excellent question, Craig. So what you're speaking to is essentially what are the effects of TINA on not just competition, but also suppliers' decision whether or not to enter and bid in the first place as a new supplier, right? So this is something that is another thing that I can measure, and I've taken some early steps towards studying, but I have not actually, what I should say is the preliminary findings are not very strong in either direction, but I haven't dug into it in sufficient detail to really figure out whether or not it's impacting it positively or negatively from that angle. That's something I plan to follow up on in future work. And it's something that's important. So this study in particular that I ran here and we just I talked about is focusing on two particular competition outcomes, right? Whether or not contract is awarded according by sole source, and whether or not contracts receive multiple bids. I also look at the number of bids received. Now, whether or not these are new suppliers to the government, or they are just more of suppliers who've already bid on contracts in the past, that's not clear from my results. And that's something that would be interesting, absolutely, to look at. Thank you, Craig. And Dave, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brad. I think it's pretty important for the audience of our program today to point out that in the United States and at the federal government level only, we have this unique requirement for cost or pricing data. And it's not what you might generally think, just go to your books, pull out the information and submit it to the government. In order to submit that information to the government and have it be relied upon in the contracting process, you have to get, your systems have to be reviewed and certified. So it's not just, I want to bid on a government contract and I'll take whatever data I have to collect for running the business. And so when we look at the issue of impact on competition, people need to understand that it requires additional steps by a company, which goes to, in some cases, the cost, because many companies find that their bookkeeping processes are not sufficient to meet the federal government's requirements for cost or pricing data. So as you've done a great job at looking at the data that's available, but it would be something worth looking at whether the costs and the steps necessary to become compliant in order to submit that data and have it accepted by the government also serve as a barrier, because that affects someone's decision to bid or not bid. And by the way, there are consequences, doesn't happen often, but a company that doesn't do it right can face both criminal and civil consequences for submitting bad or inaccurate data. It doesn't even require an intention to defraud in our federal system. Again, it doesn't happen often, but the rumor mill for those people who do business with the government often scares people. And I come by this information because we spent 3 years on the Section 809 panel, crisscrossing the country, talking to companies who weren't doing business with the government. And not all of them, but many of them pointed to this as a factor. Thanks.
Excellent. Very apt comments, Dave. So I agree that the certified data system is a large encumbrance for many contractors to be able to bid on government contracts. Now, the data is not currently available publicly for that. How many contractors attempted to pose what they would like to have as be considered a certified system, but then turns out is not approved. That would be interesting to look at and figure out what's the volume of, what percentage of these systems are turned down for this reason, but then maybe eventually become certified. There's a lot of other types of data as well that would be nice to study, Tina, more holistically, both from a competition of angle, as well as more generally, what are the costs and the benefits to the governments and the government's objectives, how well are they being met? So thank you, Dave. And Tara, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Brad, and thanks for your presentation. I join the rest of the panelists in commenting that it's a really interesting and different take on something that most of us deal with on hopefully not a daily basis, but certainly very often. I guess, could I just perhaps bother you to go back to a point you've made in a couple places in your discussion. I can't recall exactly where in the slides, but I know you've said that TINA increases competition. And I guess for me, I think it'd be really helpful to understand a little bit more about that sort of causal link, to the extent you see one. You know, for me, what has resonated with the data and your presentation most is, I think, something that Craig was sort of pulling on earlier, and that you know, we all would expect, the practitioner side would expect, perhaps because of barriers to entry or the costs that Dave was just describing, competition to suffer in certain types of procurements where companies just don't want the headaches, the costs, et cetera, and the potential ramifications for screwing it up, candidly. So the fact that you don't see that in the data is really interesting. The next step, though, the step to say that not only does TINA not necessarily chill competition, but it affirmatively increases, or it causes agencies to think differently, or to have a different approach to how they're going to procure a particular good or service. I would just love to hear, and I hope others would join me in hoping to, in liking to hear a little bit more about that relationship, that extra step to say that it affirmatively increases competition.
And that it's due to procurement paying greater attention to? Is that part of your question, or just the step that competition is increasing?
Yes, that I think you said that TINA increases competition.
Yes.
And that's sort of that's one step further than TINA does not chill competition. And so I'm curious about the sort of causal link there.
Great question, Tara. So the way I set this up is I say that essentially I predict that TINA should have in net one of two effects. It could either decrease, increase, or it actually could also have an insignificant effect on competition. Now, the reasons I give for decreasing are, one is the main, this is what many practitioners expect, is that data gathering and proprietary costs may ward off suppliers from bidding in the first place. And I know everybody who's a practitioner who's dealt with cost or pricing data for an extended period of time has experienced that, yes, contractors see this as an encumbrance. This definitely exists. Now, on the other hand, TINA could also increase competition, right? Because the procurement system, contracting officials have essentially a choice to be able to comply with TINA. They can either have multiple bids be received, or they can require the data. And that choice essentially then ends up meaning that in some cases, competition should be increased to not have to require the data. And arguably, that would be most likely, most common when it's the greatest encumbrance to suppliers. So it's from a subsample analysis perspective, it's not clear that for certain subsamples, my effects should be going the opposite direction because the costs are higher necessarily in that regard to suppliers, because then procurement is more incentivized to promote competition too. Now, the causal link that you're asking about is, so if we have two countervailing effects, one's positive, one's negative, they both can be happening at the exact same time. The question is which one is going to be stronger than cause there to be a perceived increase or decrease, statistically speaking, in competition. And so the way that I measure that is using the regression discontinuity design. And this is a graphical representation of what's the regression discontinuity design essentially finds. And that is that right at the threshold, for both threshold values, when they're in effect, there's a significant jump. And you can see it's quite linear. So this linear fit here is actually very good. It's a good representation of the change in the contracts with price. But then suddenly there's a jump right at the threshold. And that jump, the only thing that's changed between these two regions here, and I include linear price controls and other certain types of controls, is isolated to the effect of the regulation. And it's stark right at the threshold, which is important too. And that's true at both thresholds. So here's the causal evidence, I should say strong evidence that there's this positive association here for TINA to be increasing competition. Now the causal link, yeah, that's the essentially thought process and how the results show this. Does that answer your question, Tara?
It does, yeah. It's helpful to think about it as sort of just as maybe illuminating or truly graphing the decisions on the government side, and to think about it as the choice the buyer has rather than, are your contractors interested? It's something that those of us who are in the private side don't necessarily think about it on a day-to-day basis. What is the agency actually thinking about in acquisition planning and thinking through some of these pieces?
Yes, because contractors are effectively reacting to what they're being presented with by the buyer.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment, Tara. Thank you. Let's see, do we have another hand raised here? Yes, Chris.
Craig has a question.
Oh, Craig. Let's see here.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Craig.
Maybe you can help me think through this. Would you say that the absence, and this may be a no-brainer, and I apologize in advance, the absence of sole source awards is the logical equivalent to receiving multiple awards in terms of its outcome, and how you would approach this? Because you also said earlier that you may have an instance where the PO or the procurement officer or the contracting officer would receive multiple awards. And I've been with government many times, and they oftentimes have already decided who the award is going to be made to, even in the context of receiving multiple awards. So to the first question, do you see it being a logical equivalent to say that the absence of a sole source award is logically equivalent to receiving multiple bids? And is it practically the same as well?
I really like that question, Craig. And thank you for pointing that out. So the sole source is not the equivalent or the converse here of multiple bids being received, because you can have essentially sole source is a restriction on who's even allowed to bid. And it's only one vendor or supplier that's able to bid. Now you can have a full and open competition contract, which only receives one offer. And so that will have a coding of not being multiple offers and at the same time not being sole source. So they're not the opposite. One's not zero while the other is a one, or no and a yes versus yes and a no. They could be no at the same time.
Gotcha.
And then your other question is what are the practical implications here? Yes. So if the contracting official just awards to the same vendor that they were planning to all along, right? So they open up competition, don't have to require the data, but they don't change their action that they would have done had they had the option to sole sources, right? Now that is something that I address in my paper actually, and I argue that as long as the supplier expected reasonably that there would be other competing bidders, and that those other bidders are representing some threat, some level, some probability of a loss of that contract to that vendor, then that should affect their behavior, their bidding behavior. And that then is real competition. That's actually beneficial to the governments. So even though the outcome of who won is not different in that situation, if they already know with certainty who they're going to award it to, but there is a change in the bidding, the benefits to the governments from having that open competition.
Thank you.
Great question, Craig.
So Brad, can I throw in here?
Absolutely.
So as I said at the beginning of the session, we have folks from many different countries participating in this webinar. And in our country, we both in the federal government, we have a very well-developed contract formation system and a very well-developed contract administration system. And both of them really can be traced back hundreds of years. In many countries, there is a very well-developed contract formation system, but the contract administration system, including potential cost issues, is really not well developed. And in fact, cost-based contracting is relatively rare around the world. And that means in practical terms that the cost-based contracting that allows the government to take on more risk, things like research and development, just isn't mature in many countries. Your study offers some really interesting insights on how those cost-based systems of contract administration might be developed. And also, of course, this relates back for your study, back to the contract formation stage. Here's my question to you. Let's say country X wants to develop a cost-based contracting system for contract administration, public contract administration, so they can do more sophisticated research and development work and whatever it is, whether it's vaccines, let's say. Does it matter whether or not they use a government-specific cost of pricing system, which is what John was referring to before and Tara was referring to before, which creates a lot of administrative costs because you have a different accounting system essentially that you have to adopt? Does it matter whether or not they use a government-specific accounting system, or can they just use generally accepted accounting principles like we do for commercial item contracting? Does it matter if there's a government-specific system, or can they just use their normal commercial accounting system as its first step? What do you think, Brad?
I like that question, Chris, and it's one of great importance, I think, worldwide. As you mentioned, most countries do not have very sophisticated, developed cost system and requirements for that data from their essentially their suppliers, and their laws, their regulations are not set up to be able to handle that. Now, the first step in my mind is they need to have at least these countries should focus on being able to have some legal specificity, right? And perceived threat there, and some clarity, I should say, it should be clear, and it should be perceived to be enforced. That's the first step, because if that's where all of a large piece of the power from cost or pricing data in the US comes from, right? Is that you can't just turn in any data and expect it to be accepted. And you can't lie about or bend the truth, right? It needs to actually be truthfully represented. So that would be something that's I believe the first starting points. Then they can converge on which types of standards they believe are sufficient to their needs, right? And maybe the commercial standard, right, the gap that's typically used there could be a good starting point. But I believe that to be able to get the best use for the government, they're going to want to change that slightly to be able to make those laws then be more enforceable on that those contracts as well. Well, that's a great starting point, I would say, with the development of enforcement and legal clarity. Thank you for the question, Chris. So I see we have a lot of questions, but we have about 2 minutes left. Do you prefer that we continue with the questions and answers, or we go to the third question?
We have to stay within the time constraints if possible, and I apologize for that. I think we have one more question from Dave Drapkin, and then we'll have to sign off, Brad. Dave?
Yeah, just to be clear, our cost and pricing data rules also reflect our culture. I lived and worked in Europe for 6 years, and a regular business expense might be meals and alcohol and entertainment. In the United States, that's not permitted except in the rarest of circumstances. So as you're looking at cost and pricing data from a perspective of a foreign company, you have to also be familiar with the rules and the culture that drove those rules.
I think
excellent point.
Just to be clear, the reimbursement for alcohol is not permitted, and not the case that alcohol is not permitted in the United States, correct?
Unfortunately, that is correct.
All right, thank you very much. All right, folks, we're at the end of the hour. I think we need to wrap up. Brad, you did an outstanding job, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm very, very grateful for your participation. Have a great day. And as I said before, the recording of this will be available on the program page and on the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program YouTube page as well, hopefully later today. And the materials are, of course, available on the program page. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.